I wanted to start with this question, which was, how much do people drink? So there was a comment in the text that asked, or that said, that men drink more than women, and it made some other broad statements about stats about how much people drink. So I went and pulled the most recent study that we could find. This is actually from a site called Our World in Data, which is pretty awesome. This particular graph is built on the most recent World Bank data. So this is just showing us how much people drink in different countries worldwide. So this is amount. If we're going to measure per capita how much in liters do adults drink in alcohol, this is what we've got going on. In this figure, you can see how many people drink. So this was really interesting to me to flip back and forth. So this is showing what percentage of adults have drank alcohol in the last year. So these darker numbers, some of these countries, a lot of folks are drinking, but they're not really drinking that much. Or countries here where a lot of alcohol is consumed, but not by very many people. So there are some interesting patterns. I'll post these slides and you can click back and forth and see for yourself later on. The other question that came up was about the gender differences. So this figure comes from the World Health Organization data, and it's from 2010, so it's a little bit old. But what we can see is that in literally every single country that has been examined, this includes 155 countries, that in every single one, the percentage of men who drink is higher than the percentage of women. So this is the sort of one line. Somebody asked, oh, where did my annotation go? I had looked up, I don't know how I deleted it. Somebody asked, I wonder, this data that the reading was from the UK, and they had said, I wonder what it's like in the US. So in the UK, the figures were something like 87 and 81%. And in the United States, our numbers were lower. And so I think ours were like 79 and 63. So there's a bigger disparity in the US, but we also drink a little bit less than they do in the UK. The other questions that came up about alcohol consumption were really about whether alcohol consumption is healthy. So towards the end of the reading, there was conversation about how this was one of the first times that y'all had seen data about the benefits of alcohol, and that usually when you're encountering information about alcohol in health classes and stuff, it's all negative. So I've talked about this over the years with students many, many times, and the data is always messy. A couple of years ago, there was a study published in the Lancet, which is a really important medical journal, that did this statistical or systematic analysis of all of these, all of the data that is available, looking at the impact of alcohol on all different kinds of health impacts. So this study is a systematic analysis, which means that they looked at existing publications and then tried to make sense of them. So when you ask yourself this question about, is alcohol consumption healthy? It's really easy to find papers that say, yes, this is healthy, or no, this is not healthy, if they're asking really specific questions. And so it's important to look at when you're asking this kind of huge question that's going to have lots of disparate information, is to find these kinds of synthesis studies that pull it all together. So this used over 14,000 individual articles, studies that had been published that were measuring the risk ratios for consumption of alcohol at different levels for a whole bunch of different diseases. This is the link. This is open access, so anyone can read this paper, and so you can pull this off the slides when I post them, but I'll also post the link underneath because this paper has just massive amounts of data. So I pulled a few things to show you the ways in which the relationship between alcohol and health can be complicated. So the first one is a figure that all of the figures are going to show this format. So I'll talk about like what this data is trying to show. And this first one is looking at diabetes. So on this graph, we've got the number of drinks per day. For this particular graph, they've split by sex, so female and male. And then on the y-axis, we've got relative risk. So a relative risk of 1.0 means that there is no risk. That compared to sort of the reference list, the reference data, there is no relative risk, there's no increase or decrease. If a relative risk is below 1, then that means that there's a negative risk, like it's not likely to happen. And if it's above 1, that means that there is an increased risk, so it's more likely to happen. the data the way that they're showing this data is that they're showing you each individual study and the value that they found as the average risk and the uncertainty that those studies had. So for example, here's one study that was conducted that found that at 5 drinks a day, the relative risk for females was about 1.8. And then here is the range of uncertainty that study found when they analyzed it. So what this study did is it took all of these little data points. So you can see first, just looking at this, that there are data points above and there are data points below, and that a lot of these data points have pretty big uncertainty. So that the first thing that tells you is this data is really messy. The second thing that they did then is they took all of this messy data and they analyzed it and ran their own statistical analysis. And so what their work is shown in green. So this line is the estimated risk if you combine all of these studies together. This is what that average risk is based on the drinks. And then in the green shaded part, that's their uncertainty. That's the uncertainty after they looked at all of these thousands of papers. Excessive alcohol consumption leads to an increased risk of diabetes. And that's definitely true. So it varies a little bit by sex where that sort of increased risk comes in. But in females, it looks like we're crossing the line here around 5. And then for males, we're crossing the line here around 3.5. The risk significantly increases with more drinks. Yeah, so the rate of that line, the line goes up much more as the standard drinks per day go up. So this is a lot of alcohol to drink per day. It shouldn't surprise anyone that drinking this much alcohol per day will come with risks. So that's absolutely true. And if you look at their uncertainty moves more and more into the positive as the drinks go to the right. So they're more and more certain that this is increasing your risk as the data moves to the right. So what's happening right here? In that first couple of drinks, if you look at 2 drinks per day for females, so there's some protective effect here. And you can see that their uncertainty, if you look at this is what they think it is, their whole range of uncertainty is still below this 1.0 line. So for this little pocket right here, there's strong data to suggest that there is a decreased risk for diabetes. And then even though the line is below 1 here, now we start to get to a point where okay, the line is here, but we're not really sure. Now we've crossed the 1.0 line. And so maybe there's an effect, maybe there's not an effect. But in this little pocket right here, there seems to be strong data for protective effect. Interestingly, that's not the case here. So this dip is a lot smaller and the uncertainty range never drops below 1. And so there's no statistical significance showing that that is actually an effect. Okay, so this is one example of the way that this data is messy. So depending on your sex and depending on how much you're drinking, alcohol consumption can be harmful or beneficial for diabetes. Here's another one. So this one is cardiovascular disease. And this one looks really similar to the last one. We see a little dip here that is statistically significant. There's some protective effect. And this one is also true for males, although the effect is smaller, but there is some protective effect for both in this particular chart. And then again, once we get above a certain level of alcohol consumption, the risk is going up for everybody. So they looked at different measures of cardiovascular disease. This is one where they were looking at just high blood pressure. And this is also really interesting because what they basically show is that if you have 1 drink a day, there's no effect. It's whether it's 0 or 1 didn't do anything. But anything above that increases your relative risk for increased blood pressure, which I think is counterintuitive. A lot of folks have misconceptions about the impacts of alcohol on cardiovascular health. And one of the things that folks see and that some studies have shown, there's a couple of these in here, right, that are showing a protective effect. But if we look at all of the data put together, that data doesn't stand up. So there are studies that say drinking alcohol is good for your blood pressure individually. But if we look at all of the studies that exist on this topic, that's not what they say. Okay, I brought you a few more. This one is cirrhosis and chronic liver disease. So this one should be pretty straightforward, right? We would never expect to see a protective effect. Relative risk is higher because the increments of measurements shown here are higher. So if you're skimming through these graphs and you're just click, 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 then you might look at this graph and say, oh, it's weird, you don't see an increase until 6. But what you have to notice is that this scale, this goes from 0 to 10. All of these other ones are under that mark. So this one tops at 8. This one is topping at 3.5. So cardiovascular disease increases your risk, but only to a certain point. I mean, doubling your risk is kind of a big deal, right? This one is showing you that 6 drinks a day, this is 10 times your risk. So the scale of risk here is much, much higher than the others. So there's never a protective effect for your liver. The same is true for liver cancer. Liver cancer doesn't have the same scale. So the risk is smaller, but the risk is always negative. So there's never a protective effect, even though there are studies that have landed down below somehow. But again, those studies have error bars, have uncertainty that's really, really large. Okay, I brought you 2 more. This is colon and rectal cancer. So I think it's clear why the liver is impacted, because the liver is the thing that is processing alcohol, but the whole body is impacted by alcohol and the metabolites that are created. So if you're feeling the effects of alcohol in your brain, it's because the alcohol is in your blood, right? It's everywhere. So I wanted to bring you a couple of other examples of cancer that are not related to the processing of alcohol. So colon and rectal cancer is one that has an increased risk. And you also read in the reading that breast cancer has an increased risk. Breast cancer's increased risk, I think, is a little bit more interesting too, because the slope of this first part between the 0 and the 1 line is pretty high compared to some of these other ones that sort of start out small. This one goes up right away. And someone asked in the reading, is this because of alcohol's impact on estrogen? So alcohol does impact your estrogen levels, and that's one mechanism of cancer that probably contributes to increased in cancer risk. For breast cancer, that's true. And there are other cancers that are also estrogen sensitive. So estrogen acts on cells all over the body, not just on cells that are part of the reproductive system. So yes, that is part of the answer. There are other things that are also part of the answer. Acetaldehyde is the thing that we metabolize alcohol into, and we'll look at that pathway in just a second. And that's a carcinogen. So you're creating acetaldehyde every time that you break down a molecule of ethanol, and that molecule in itself has impacts on the DNA of cells, any cells that it's interacting with. The other big thing that happens is that metabolism generates these reactive oxygen species. So when you read about dietary elements that are antioxidant, they're binding up these things. So reactive oxygen species means that there are molecules floating around with oxygens that that aren't full of electrons, or that have extra electrons. And so they are very interactive. And so they're bouncing and reacting with molecules all over the cells, and they're messing things up. So that gets increased when we are metabolizing our alcohol. We already said that it increases estrogen level, which has cancer impacts. And then this last one also gets to the idea of how it might affect digestion or metabolism more broadly. So alcohol consumption tends to lower intakes of other things. When folks are consuming alcohol, they're consuming less of other nutrient-rich foods. They're replacing some of the food that they would have eaten or drinks that they would have had with alcohol. And so that means that overall, you're lowering the amount of good stuff you're putting in your body. So the antioxidants that would be defeating this, you're putting less of those in. And alcohol impacts the absorption of those nutrients. So you're putting fewer nutrients in, and your small intestine is less able to absorb the nutrients that you are putting in. And so that can lead to malnutrition, and that malnutrition has broad effects that include dampening the immune system, and the immune system is the only protection that you've got internally against developing cancer. Both of this is also impacted by genetics, of course, because everyone has their own cancer predispositions that are built into their DNA, and folks have predispositions or genetic differences in the ways that they metabolize alcohol that can increase some of these individual risks. There's also messy data about this, but the research is pretty clear that there's no protective amount of alcohol consumption that's going to cause benefit to the pregnancy. And even really, really low consumption of alcohol during pregnancy increases the risk of low birth weight. So if someone consumes less than 2 drinks a week, that can still increase their risks for low birth weight and preterm delivery, which then increase the risks of complications for both the parent and the child. You read also about things like fetal alcohol syndrome, which is not unclear. I think everybody understands that drinking to the point of intoxication during pregnancy is a problem and causes all kinds of things, including fetal alcohol syndrome, miscarriage, and stillbirth. All of those things are related. But the really low consumption, the idea of if I'm pregnant, can I have a glass of wine? The risks are small, but there are increased risks at every level. So putting all this together, back to this original study that we looked at all this data from, this study also looked at things like how impactful is alcohol on economic factors, how many days of mortality or morbidity are lost because of alcohol, how many people die because of one of these other conditions that they developed due to their alcohol intake, and places it at the 7th leading cause of death overall, and says that if you put all of these stats together, including the protective ones and the ones that are clearly really harmful, and you look at if someone has 1 glass of alcohol a day, what's the sort of net risk to their health? It's always negative. So there's no amount of alcohol that causes a net benefit for health, because benefit in one place comes with risks in another. Don't ever drink rubbing alcohol. And also there are different forms of rubbing alcohol, isopropanol being one and methanol being another. And these things metabolize into formaldehyde. And I forget what this one is, but it's really bad. So that's why you can't drink them. If you have ever had a pet that got into antifreeze, this is why that's toxic. Always keep your antifreeze containers closed, because they're sweet and they smell good and pets want to drink them. It's weird. So there's your little PSA about that. And this, I brought this to just sort of lay out, because I don't think your book did this well, explaining when your blood alcohol concentration is this, what kinds of things do we feel? And at what point are we legally impaired? The legal impairment is pretty low on this list. And then at what point is your blood alcohol level becoming dangerous? What I really want to talk to you about, and the people had most questions about, is the way that the liver metabolizes alcohol, because there are these 2 different pathways, and y'all had questions about those pathways and how they are intersecting and how they're intersecting with the larger metabolic pathways that are happening in the body. So I'm going to show you this picture a couple of times. And this is the first pathway. So this is the ADH pathway. So there are 2 molecules called ADH, and they always mess people up. And we've already talked about one this year, which was antidiuretic hormone, which is a totally different thing than alcohol dehydrogenase. So don't get them messed up. So alcohol dehydrogenase is why this is named that way. And it's the enzyme that is converting alcohol to acetaldehyde. So this is the enzyme that first breaks down alcohol, and it requires NAD+. So it's taking the energy from that alcohol and putting it into an electron carrier the same way that glycolysis takes energy from glucose and puts it on electron carriers. So it requires that input. Alcohol is the thing that makes you feel intoxicated. So when the alcohol level is high in your blood, you feel intoxicated. When ADH is doing its job and breaking alcohol down and removing it, your intoxication goes away. When ADH then creates acetaldehyde, acetaldehyde is a primary driver of hangover and all of the uncomfortableness, and is also the thing that's carcinogenic. So having this at higher levels in your blood, this is what's causing the hangover symptoms and many of the uncomfortable aspects of alcohol intake. Then there's a second enzyme called ALDH, which is acetaldehyde dehydrogenase. It also takes an electron off, so it also requires these electron carriers to function. And it makes this byproduct called acetate, and acetate is not harmful. So acetate can then feed into the cellular respiration pathways, and I'll show you that in a minute. So this is a 2-step pathway. We go from alcohol to acetaldehyde to acetate, and this requires 2 NAD+. The other path, so this is present always. We'll talk about the genetic differences and whether or not people have high or low functioning ADH and ALDH and how that impacts their experience of alcohol. So we'll talk about flushing in a minute. But this is the pathway that's in everyone. This is the primary pathway that is functioning to process alcohol. The MEOS system is the system that kicks in when there's too much alcohol for the first pathway to function. So when this pathway becomes overwhelmed, the liver cells adapt, and they adapt by increasing the capability of this system. So the MEOS system is just a way that cells are using this other process called microsomes to break ethanol down. So this system already exists in the body, and it's used for metabolizing other stuff. So other kinds of drugs, like illegal drugs, cocaine, marijuana, etc., they are all also metabolized in the same way, and which is one of the reasons why consuming multiple substances together can often increase their effect, because what it means is that your system that is responsible for breaking those things down is overloaded because you've put multiple things in at the same time. This increases your alcohol tolerance because it's adding an additional way for alcohol to be broken down in the body. So you can consume more alcohol and your body can handle it. Your body can, without getting overly intoxicated, because your body's quickly breaking down the alcohol. This also increases with use. So someone who's consuming alcohol all the time or often is going to have a much larger capacity here than someone who is not. Okay, so those are the two systems. This is another way to look at the ADH system, or the whole system together. So here's the ADH system that's working like this. And the MEOS system is just a sort of a replacement over here that's also creating acetaldehyde and feeding into this final product. So if there's not very much alcohol in the body, then you've got a low concentration and this is sufficient to function. So the processing will just go like this. And if there's a lot of alcohol in the body, then this is still going to be working, but this is also going to kick in. So at the end, we get acetate, and acetate converts to acetyl-CoA. And you've heard about acetyl-CoA because that's the input for the citric acid cycle. So if we remember back a couple of weeks when we learned about glycolysis and the citric acid or Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, acetyl-CoA is the input. So if we eat glucose, glucose gets converted to acetyl-CoA, and that's what leads to this. And alcohol, in a different mechanism, gets converted to acetyl-CoA that can then feed into the citric acid cycle. So you read in the book that alcohol contains about 7 kilocalories per gram of, that's the end of that sentence. And this is the way that calories are harvested from alcohol. If they're harvested from alcohol because they get converted to acetyl-CoA, and then acetyl-CoA can feed into cell respiration and go make ATP. However, some of the acetyl-CoA that's formed here is not going to be able to go into the citric acid cycle because the citric acid cycle is maxed out. So this is a really hard question, but I want everyone to look at this and see if you can think. So looking at this whole system, if you've got a lot of alcohol consumption and you're doing all of these things, why would you not be able to use the citric acid cycle? What's the thing that's happening in the citric acid cycle? The biggest product of the citric acid cycle. This is a great final exam review question. This process consumes a whole bunch of these electron carriers. So when you're breaking down alcohol, you're using up electron carriers. So just like glycolysis can't keep going without recycling these things, and that's why we ferment, this process is using up all of these and they're not getting recycled, right? So these can then go to the electron transport chain and be used up. But that system can't keep up if we're making these all over the place. So if all of these NAD pluses are used up, my slide didn't open. The major function of the citric acid or Krebs cycle is to load electron carriers. So it needs a massive input of NAD plus, because what it's putting out is all of those NADHs that are then feeding the electron transport chain. So if you're consuming all of these NAD pluses because you've put so much alcohol into the blood, then that means the citric acid cycle is going to be running really slowly because it doesn't have enough of these to function. So these pathways end up competing because they're both reliant. So this is why metabolism is so complicated, because all of these pathways that we've talked about the whole semester, they're all connected. They're all related in some way. And so this is the way that these are related. So what happens is you get all this acetyl-CoA left over. that can't be processed, that's just hanging around in the liver. So that acetyl-CoA, usually we're making acetyl-CoA by these different processes, but this arrow can also go backwards. A lot of these arrows can go backwards. So if we have a whole bunch of acetyl-CoA and it can't go forward because that process is stalled, then what it can do is be converted into fatty acid. And that is the origin of all fatty liver disease, where that fat is then deposited in the liver because that acetyl-CoA couldn't be used. Everybody with me? This is very complex, but these were some of the questions that y'all were asking about, like, how is this related? How is fatty liver disease related? How do you get it from alcoholism? This is also one of the reasons why you tend to see round bellies on folks that have alcoholism, because they're consuming a lot of alcohol, and that means their fatty liver disease is making their liver expand. Your liver's already huge, but your liver can expand to a little bit and make you look a little bit more bloated as well. Speaking of that, I want to make clear that there are sort of distinctions between the different kinds of liver disease that happens and when they happen and whether they're reversible. So fatty liver disease actually happens really, really quickly. So if someone goes to beach week and like binge drinks every day, they will have fat deposits in their liver that they didn't have at the start. Fortunately, they're usually reversible. So that fat won't be stored there forever. That fat will be present in the liver for a period of time. But if the excessive drinking stops, then that fat will eventually be processed, and just like any other fat in the body, will be able to enter those pathways and be gone. Fatty liver disease can also happen because of other eating habits. So it's not just alcohol that leads to this, but eating a diet that's high in saturated fat and not strong in fiber and other things can also lead to fatty liver disease. So this is sort of stage one that happens right away. Hepatitis happens next. So if we've got this happening, we've got acetaldehyde present in the liver on a regular basis. There's extra fat deposits. We get extra inflammation. So inflammation of the liver that's what hepatitis means. So itis always means inflammation and hepa means liver. So hepatitis literally just means inflammation of the liver. And it's swelling because the immune system is trying to come in and deal with this extra fat accumulation and the damage that's being done by reactive oxygen species and acetaldehyde. And so you get swelling in the liver and inflammation. So that is also usually reversible, but is much more harmful and is much more likely to cause symptoms. Fatty liver disease usually doesn't until it's very advanced, and at which point you're sort of moving into this stage anyway. Hepatitis is often the stage where people first notice symptoms of their liver disease. Cirrhosis is the final stage of liver disease, and it's when the liver cells are so damaged that they're damaged beyond repair. They die and are not replaced, and instead they're replaced with scar tissue. So that is permanent. Scar tissue is permanent in the body wherever you've got it. It can soften a little bit over time, but it's not going to go away. And so cirrhosis is permanent. All right, the last little piece of what I wanted to talk about are the things that affect alcohol absorption and the things that affect intoxication versus hangover. So you read about factors that affect alcohol absorption. We saw that sex is one, and it's because females produce less ADH than males genetically. I don't know which genes are controlling this, but this is true. Muscle mass. This is another place where the amount of lean muscle mass in your body changes something about water distribution, and that impacts alcohol absorption as well. So the greater muscle mass you have means you have more water, which means the alcohol is diluted and easier processed. So you'll have less alcohol in the blood. Someone who is larger means that they have a larger liver, and that means that they have more liver cells that can digest alcohol. So a larger person will process alcohol more quickly. Age also affects it, and it affects it. I think this is so interesting, that ADH levels decline in males, but increase in females with time. So males will be less able to process alcohol as they get older, but females will become more able to process alcohol as they get older. And finally, there are genetics that impact all of this. Some people have high or low enzyme activity, and so that will change the way that they're going to affect alcohol all the time. So we said already that a hangover's primary symptoms is acetaldehyde. So alcohol is causing intoxication. So the things that people are usually seeking when they are consuming alcohol, that's what we're talking about, intoxication, these feelings of euphoria and relaxation, happiness. That is the effect of alcohol. It's also the things like balance and inability to function on numerous levels, but at a low level is what we're talking about. Hangover is caused by acetaldehyde, and it's also caused by these other kinds of things. So depending on what you're drinking, there are other chemicals in some beverages that people have problems with. So there are sulfides and tannins that are present in different wines or other beverages, and we call them congeners, and those can be problematic for individuals. So some people just can't drink this, they'll make them feel better. And then the other big part is dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. So this is why it is extremely good advice to alternate your alcoholic beverage with a non-alcoholic beverage, especially something that has electrolytes in it. Anything with sugar or salt is great so that you're not dehydrated. Okay, so, and like Patrick said earlier, hangover tends to last a lot longer than intoxication. And it's because that second step of breaking down the alcohol is slower than the first one. So you can have hangover symptoms a whole 24 hours later, even though alcohol has been gone for a long time, because acetaldehyde is still hanging around. Okay, so my question for you, because everybody wants to know this, is it possible for you to manipulate your system to prevent or shorten a hangover? There are many speculations on the internet about ways in which people might do this. So I've collected 4 different things that people have discussed. And I want you to think about them and think about if any of them would work and what they would actually do. So the first one is called blowfish. This is something you can purchase over the counter. Like I think it comes in a little tablet, like an Alka-Seltzer, and you drop it into something and it fizzes and you drink it. It's got aspirin, caffeine, and an antacid in it. And of course you're drinking with water. This one, fomepizole, is an ADH inhibitor. So it means that your ADH enzyme won't function. And it's designed for methanol poisoning when someone accidentally consumes methanol so that they don't create formaldehyde and die. Antabuse is a prescription ALDH inhibitor. So it inhibits that second step from acetaldehyde to acetate. And then this last one, I found on a very interesting blog one time where someone was talking about pre-gaming with yeast mixed into yogurt to increase the amount of ADH that they had in their body when they started drinking, because both yeast and yogurt contain live cells that also contain ADH. Okay, so there's your context for what all this is. I'm going to put this back up so you can see what impact this things might have. And I want you to think about what was brought up earlier about this idea of roadblocks. And like when we talked about the electron transport chain and why you have to breathe or you die, if we put roadblocks in at some of these points, if we stop this thing from functioning, if we stop this thing from functioning, if we hit the gas on this and really drive it forward, what's going to happen? What's going to build up in the body? What's going to decline in the body? Is someone going to be more intoxicated or less intoxicated? Are they more likely to get a hangover? Or are they not going to get a hangover? An ALDH inhibitor, so that's this one, antabuse, would block the process of making the acetaldehyde and making the hangover even worse, not the process, the processing. So if we can't do this, we can't process this, which means that this is going to stick around and hangover is going to be worse. It might start earlier. It will definitely last longer. It will be worse. So this is why this drug is used. So antabuse is a prescription that is written for people who are trying to overcome alcoholism. And it's because if you take this and then drink, you're going to have a terrible time and then you're not going to continue drinking. So that is what it's used for. The fomepizole, the ADH inhibitor that is designed to prevent methanol poisoning. If this doesn't work, then that means alcohol can't break down into acetaldehyde. So what's going to happen to the alcohol? So just like if this was being used for methanol poisoning, eventually the alcohol will be excreted from the body. So you read about how a certain percentage of alcohol is excreted through urine, that most of it is processed in this pathway before it gets excreted, but a small amount of it is excreted in the urine. It's excreted in your breath too, right? And that's why breathalyzer works. So it would take a while, but eventually this alcohol would be processed out of the body, and so would the methanol. So if you go into the ER and they give you this, you just have to wait it out until the methanol goes. There might be other molecules that they can give you to speed up the processing. I don't actually know. or to speed up the excretion, they would probably give you a whole bunch of IV fluids to make you urinate it out. Okay, so we have those two questions. So back to this one though, if we block this, then if you're talking about alcohol, what's going to be the impact? So your alcohol is going to be sticking around for a long time, which means your intoxication is going to last for a long time. It also means, and that you won't need very much alcohol to get intoxicated. So someone that has a low functioning ADH means that when they consume alcohol, it's going to take a while for it to get processed, which means a little bit of alcohol is going to cross you over that sort of blood alcohol level limit to intoxication. So you'll need less alcohol to get intoxicated. And it also means that this process is trickling through, right? So the levels of acetaldehyde that you're making, this will eventually get processed or this will get excreted, but you're never going to have a whole bunch of this. It's not going to build up. And so you won't have a hangover. So someone that has a low ADH is likely to get drunk really easily, but not have hangovers often. Okay, so that's what the ADH inhibitor does. The other ones, let's talk about this one. Let's keep it with the enzymes. So yeast and yogurt, if you increase your ADH and you make a whole bunch more ADH, then what's going to happen? Sort of the opposite of the ADH inhibitor. When you drink alcohol, it's going to be immediately converted into acetaldehyde. So that means you're going to need to consume a whole lot more alcohol before you feel intoxicated. It also means that you're going to be creating acetaldehyde much more rapidly. And we already said that this is a slower step, which means you're much more likely, you're just driving yourself towards a hangover. The source of this was on a site for a group of people who were going to do brewery tastings. And they really wanted to be able to try all of the beers. And they were like, well, we can't have, we can't drink all the beers because we'll be way too drunk and they'll cut us off. So let's take a bunch of ADH before we go, and then we'll be able to drink a lot more beers and taste all the wonderful beers. Unfortunately, they may not have taken this class because I bet they had a really bad time at the end. They would have felt hungover instead of intoxicated. The last one up here, or the first one, was blowfish. So blowfish doesn't interact with this at all. It treats the symptoms. So aspirin and caffeine both will help with a headache. So the pain that is occurring in a headache depends on what kind of headache you have. One reason why people get headaches, and the reason that's primarily responsible for this kind of headache, is because your blood vessels have expanded. So if your blood vessels in your brain are swollen out, then that will put pressure on your brain and hurt. It also hurts in the other way. So one of the things that caffeine does is it shrinks your blood vessels down. It makes them contract. And so it releases some of the pressure from the physical pain of expanding blood vessels in the brain. An antacid will just, make you feel less nauseous if that's one of your symptoms the next day. And aspirin is just for overall pain too, just like for the headache. So that one doesn't do anything to change your intoxication. It doesn't do anything to get acetaldehyde out of your body any faster. So it doesn't actually treat your hangover, but it might make you feel better. So I have a question for you, and it's kind of a final exam review-y kind of question because it intersects this idea with the last 2 weeks. My question to you is, can alcohol fuel anaerobic exercise? Okay, remember this? We've seen this before. And let's recall this. So the only thing that can be used for anaerobic exercise are carbohydrates. And furthermore, alcohol uses this up. So alcohol is using up these electron carriers, which actually prevents glycolysis from going forward, just like it prevents the citric acid cycle. And it's not a carbohydrate, so it cannot be used to fuel anaerobic exercise. However, it can be used to fuel aerobic exercise because it converts to acetyl-CoA, right? So if you've got acetyl-CoA and you have oxygen present because you're doing aerobic exercise, then those electrons, that energy can be used for that. This is not a recommendation that you use alcohol as your pre-workout fuel.